This is going to be a review for the midterm. I'm not going to go. It is cumulative. I'm not going to go over theory and methods because I already did that in the review for the first exam. So you can refer to that for those concepts. So I'm going to just go through some of the things that we covered after the first exam that are going to be on the midterm. Okay. So we'll start in the culture chapter, and it's important to understand the difference, the types of items that exist in a culture. Material items are things that are tangible. So things that are very popular material items in our culture, I would say, would be like cell phones, cars, things like that, right? Symbolic are things that are just that. They're symbolic. You can't really see them. So this would be in terms of like tangibility. So like it's praying. It's not an item. It's more of like a behavior. Okay. Fasting. Those would be symbolic. Now there are times, and I would never try and trick you on an exam, where something may really in nature be symbolic, but actually be a material item. This would be something like maybe wearing a cross around your neck, right? It's an actual tangible item, but its meaning is very symbolic. Okay, and and I wouldn't do anything to trick you like that on a question on an exam. But there are tattoos are another one that are kind of tricky. But just realize that there are different types of cultural items. Some are far more symbolic, like praying and fasting, and then some can be clearly material, like utensils, for example. So our cultural values create norms, okay, and sanctions, ways of enforcing those norms. I'm actually going to add in here really quickly because I don't want it to seem like anything's a trick. Uh, when we talk about norms, we talk about informal and formal norms. So informal norms are things that we call them folkways. These are behaviors. These are rules that are there's not really a formal or legal consequence. So like butting in line, maybe burping in public, right, or farting in public, or saying a curse word in the middle of a church service, right? Um, we would consider those to be folkways because the sanction, which is often how we determine whether or not they are formal or informal, is not a legal sanction. It's not the law. The norm has not been codified into law. Now, there is actually a difference between mores and laws. I'm not going to try and um, they can be the same thing. Mores just tend to have more of a severe consequence, right? So, for example, there might be a private school that would kick you out if a girl were to get pregnant, for example, right? Or and that and that might so while that's not really a law in our society, it might be a more for that particular institution. Maybe I when I grew up, I went to a church where if you were divorced, you could not become a deacon. Okay, so with mores, um, there are these formal kind of rules that there are some to some extent consequences, um, but not necessarily laws that have been codified, right? But some of them are laws, right? And so I'm not trying to I wouldn't try to have you distinguish between mores and laws, although I think you probably could. I kind of lump those together as formal norms. Okay, that means that they have formal consequences. Um, and then things that are taboo are things you don't even want to think about because it's so disgusting to you, so repulsive. And that's going to be more cultural, right? So for a lot of us, right, we do have commonalities and things that we think are taboo, right? Things like ancestral relationships, right? Uh, Pedophilia, right? But we also know that, and while that might be common in our culture for us to think, and then some taboos are codified into law, some are not, right? There might be some cultures where they believe that, or they look at something like abortion as taboo, right? But in our country, abortion is legal, right? People can get an abortion. People get abortions, right? So, folkways often have more to do with one's culture, as do taboos. However, with laws specifically, these are, while they do have to do with someone, with a culture, this is something that it has more to do with the culture of a society or culture of a state that is creating these laws. Whereas folkways or taboos may be more individual, right? Like where I grew up, or when I grew up, and my granddad, if I put my elbow on the table, he would actually kind of slap at it with with the butt of a knife, right? That's more individual. Okay, that's a folkway informal. All right. Okay, I want to move on. So cultural leveling is when um, cultures start to become similar. Okay, and I oh, there's Timmy again barking. Um, so um, cultural leveling often occurs when larger um, chain type places, places like Walmart, when they come in, it puts more pressure on smaller businesses. It makes it harder for smaller businesses to stay afloat. And especially if a Walmart comes in and then another place comes in, like a TGI Fridays and a Home Depot and a Panera. Now we're putting even more pressure on these small businesses. This can lead to these small businesses going under, ultimately leaving us with the same place, same businesses everywhere we go, right? So if you were to, so I grew up in Cecil County. If you were to go to Elkton, Maryland, which is our county seat, much like Hagerstown is here in Washington County, you would actually find that it's very similar, right? We actually have a Route 40 as well, and on that Route 40, it looks a lot like our Route 40, with some little convenience store type places like uh, we don't have Sheets out our way. We have things like rural farms and Wawas, and but we have those Chili's and TGI Fridays and Paneras and all those places, and they all exist, right? So that's what cultural leveling is referring to. Okay, subcultures are we all have kind of our individual culture, and that's how we view the world, but we have subcultures that we're a part of as well. Um, right? I always like to think about this in terms of sports teams, right? So sports teams, right? Subculture of sports teams in general, right, would be football, right? And then a subculture of football might be college, and then a subculture of college might be your actual team, the Florida Gators, for example, right? One thing I want to point out about countercultures can be positive, okay? Countercultures go against the norm. They can be negative too. I mentioned in the PowerPoint, the culture PowerPoint, Westboro Baptist, right? I would say that they are a negative counterculture, right? They go to funerals and they put up signs that say your son or daughter deserve to die. Okay, that's going against the norm. But I look at that as probably a negative counterculture, in my opinion. Okay. I would look at something like the civil rights movement as a positive counterculture, right? Um, it was going counter to the norm, but it was doing something good. Okay, so one thing I want you to, and so countercultures, whether they're positive, negative, neutral, that also is going to have to do with your cultural perspective. But the thing I want to point out is cultural countercultures can be positive. Ideal and real culture. This is just the ideally, right? Um, let's say the workplace. Ideally, the culture in a workplace is you get hired or you get promoted because of what you do or your background, right? Especially when it comes to things like promotions. You would get promoted ideally because you show up on time, you do good work, you have great ideas, and so on, right? Does the real culture match the ideal culture? Well, we know in reality that some people get promoted because their dad's the boss, because they're friends, because they suck up, whatever it might be, okay? So it's just really looking at the ideal and real culture that exists in particular institutions. To differentiate pop and high culture, this is important. It's who consumes the item that makes it higher pop culture. It's not about the price. That's what people sometimes think. You're probably, I'm almost certain, you're going to pay more to go see Taylor Swift or Justin Bieber than you would to go see Yo-Yo Ma, world-class cellist. It's who's consuming the item that makes it pop or high culture. Okay. In fact, I looked this up a while back when there were concerts going on, and one of those famous female singers, I think Taylor Swift, Miley Cyrus, something like that. It was like $300 or $400 to buy a ticket to go see them. And I looked up Yo-Yo Ma prices, and it was somewhere around $100. The important thing to understand about what makes an item pop or high culture is who consumes it. All right. So this is when we talked about the melting pot, and thinking, and you may have heard this growing up or at some point, people saying, "Well, United States is like a melting pot." What does that mean? Well, from a sociological perspective, someone might say, "Well, what it means is that just like cheeses would all come together, you put Swiss cheese, you put American cheese, you put cheddar cheese, you put them all in a melting pot. When you go look in that melting pot, you can't distinguish the Swiss cheese. It all comes together as one." And so people said, and so the same thing would hold true with cultural assimilation. Does society look like everyone has come together and you cannot distinguish different groups? Well, when people heard others describing the United States as being culturally assimilated, they said, "Whoa, whoa, that's not what I see. And it looks more like a salad bowl." Right? We're all together, but I can see the tomato, and I can see the cheese, and I can see the lettuce, and I can see the croutons, right? So I think what we settled on as sociologists is that the United States at large doesn't look like either. But there are certain areas that might be more culturally assimilated, right? Where I grew up, and I've been out. So where I grew up, kind of probably like a Boonesboro, maybe a Smithsburg type place, maybe a little bit more rural than that. I haven't been to Hancock to know, but I've had students that say, yeah, it's kind of like that. But um, to these would be where you really do look at everyone, and everyone does kind of look the same, right? And maybe they have the same values. Whereas when I lived in Baltimore City, um, there were different areas that were distinctly different, right? When you go to New York City, there are different areas that are distinctly different, and they value, right? If you go to Miami, um, there are restaurants. There's a McDonald's in Miami, in a certain part of Miami, where you walk in, the menu's in Spanish. right? And so multicultural societies value that diversity, whereas cultural assimilation is more like assimilate. Okay. I've talked to you about Andrew Zimmern. I wanted you to watch videos. Andrew Zimmern, in my opinion, is a great example of using cultural relativism when approaching other cultures. This is actually really important in sociology to move away from an ethnocentrism point of view where you are judging. That's really what ethnocentrism is. You're saying, well, that's odd, or that's weird, or that's different, as if your perspective is what's normal, right? Cultural relativism perspective, which Andrew Zimmern uses very often, is more about understanding those that, hey, our cultures are just different, right? They may be eating, and I showed you the eating ones just because that's kind of, I don't know, it's interesting, I think, right? Eating maggot cheese, drinking snake blood or snake venom or whatever it was, right? Eating all these different things. Many of you probably like, ew, that's gross, right? But are there things that people look at in our culture where the people are like, ooh, that's gross, right? So I think that's important to understand is that cultural relativism is more about like understanding differences in culture, and ethnocentrism is more about judging those. All right, let's move on. Okay, so when we talk about socialization, I think the first question we ask is, are we socialized? That's the nurture side of the debate. Or is it just inborn, nature side of the debate, right? Both can be true. As sociologists, we tend to focus on the nurture side. Okay, and so that's why when I went through that part in the PowerPoint and I tried to give different examples, someone may be an alcoholic because it's genetic, but sociologists are focused on socialization. So can we look at risk factors? Can we look at socialization, things that might contribute or exacerbate a natural condition, right? And so the nurture side is what we focus on. That's the socialization side. Okay. Most textbooks describe the primary agents of socialization as your family, your peers, schools, and mass media. But we know that there are other agents of socialization, like religion, the government, sports, and so on, right? I'm not going to go into detail of in all of those because I did go through that in the PowerPoint, but that's what agents of socialization are, okay? Now, let's move on and talk about statuses. All right, so we have all these statuses. Some are ascribed. These are the ones you're born with. So for me, I was born male. That would be an ascribed status. Achieved status, things you earned, right? So I'm an associate professor at Hagerstown Community College. That is an earned, achieved status, okay? Your master status is when society looks at you, what is the most important status that they see, okay? For most people, it's their occupation. It's not always, I mean, that's just what tends to be most valued in our society because your occupation dictates how much money you have, where you live, where you send your kids to school, the type of healthcare you have, where you shop, how safe the neighborhood is, all those things, right? So, um, I had a student once. I said, "What do you think your master status is?" And she said, "It's being a good mother." And I said, "No, it might be important to you, which of course it is, but society expects that of you. Now, if you were a bad mother, oh my gosh, we're watching this show right now. It's so awful. It's the trials of Gabriel Hernandez. I can't. I just. I don't. My wife wants to finish it, and I'm like, it makes me sick watching it. But the parents there, the mother there, her master status probably is being a neglectful, murdering mother. Assuming that's what I haven't seen the end yet, and I hope I didn't ruin anything for you. But if you, for many convicted criminals, that often is their master status. Okay, that's what society sees as very important. All right, statuses have roles. Okay, so we have a lot of different statuses. Your status as a student, that's a status you have. Okay, what's your role? That's the expected behavior. So your role as a student is to get on D2L, go through the assignments, look at all the stuff for the week, and then take a quiz, write your journal entry, right? And then go outside and meditate and think about all this stuff, right? Process it. Start creating your study guide. Read, right? There's all the expectations of being a student. Those are the roles of your status as being a student. Okay. Now let's say that you're a soccer player. That's your status. Your role would be to show up to practice, right? Probably prepared to, you got your shin guards, you got your cleats, you're ready to roll, you're ready, okay? You're expected to be in shape, okay? Because we have so many different statuses, so that means we have a lot of different roles, it's inevitable that they conflict, right? And I often get this a lot. I'll have, especially when I'm teaching face to face, is I'll have a student who will say, you send me an email in the morning before class, can't make it to class today, which is his or her role of being a student. And they say, I can't make it to class because my son is sick. I got to stay home with him. So what's going on here? They have two particular statuses that are involved here, being a parent and being a student. And the role is take care of your child. That's the role of being a parent. And then your role of being a student is to be in class. They are conflicting. Okay, that's called role conflict. Role strain is a struggle within one role. I always use the example that my dad used to say before giving me a spanking. It hurts me more than it hurts you. That would be an example of role strain. You love your child, but this is how you feel. Now we know that spanking isn't a particularly good way of disciplining children. However, this was 30 years ago or longer. But it's a struggle within one role. Okay, I'm not going to worry too much about primary or secondary groups. Resocialization is important. This is having to learn new norms with new positions in life, right? So, probably the biggest one for me was becoming a dad. Because prior to that, um, I could really do whatever I wanted. So if I wanted to go golfing, I could go golfing. If I wanted to, do whatever, just whatever I wanted to do, I could do it. I go out with my friends, blah blah blah, right? I had to learn new norms though. When my wife had our son, because then it became, well, okay, I need to make sure that, especially early on, that there's a lot of time spent making sure that your baby's getting fed. They got to get up a lot, right? And my wife and I split those duties. Um, Another example of resocialization might be leaving school of whatever, maybe it's high school or college, and entering the career world, the job world, right? So in college, you show up late to class a couple times, you turn in work a little late, it's probably not the end of the world. You might still pass the class. However, that same behavior probably would not be acceptable in many jobs. Right? You have to learn those new values and norms. The looking glass self is using, sorry, this is kind of complicated, but so you don't know what people are thinking about you, but you see them, right? You see them looking at you. So you are trying to base judgment on yourself on what you think they're thinking about you. That's what the looking glass self is. It's creating a perception of yourself based on what you think they're thinking. Okay? And polysemy is a cool concept, I think. So I like Crocs. Okay? Um, in fact, my wife does not like Crocs. Okay? In fact, I had what I would describe as dress Crocs. I think I might have put a picture on the PowerPoint. I had leather. Okay? And I'm glad to see that Crocs are coming back. I think that Crocs are cool. Okay? Um, how is it that this Croc is despised by my wife, but yet I think it looks all right? It's the same Croc, right? Well, it's because we are actually our lenses make us see things differently. So that's really what polysemy is. It's the same product, the same thing, the same behavior can have different interpretations based on one's cultural upbringing, one's lens. Okay? Deviance. Some things I want to talk about in the deviance chapter. First, crime statistics are based on people who got caught committing crime. Okay? So, as we're in the deviance chapter, I hear sirens. How interesting is that? Um, so, that's very important to understand is that crime statistics are based on people who were caught committing crimes. Okay? What does that mean? It means that if there are areas that there is less policing, the same crimes may go unreported. In areas that are heavily policed, crime may be more visible and therefore caught more. Okay? Now, self-fulfilling prophecy. Oh, I didn't go over stereotyping. It can come in here, that's fine. Stereotyping is an idea. Okay? It's a thought based on something. It's based on maybe experience one had, something someone told you, something you saw on social media, in the news, whatever it might be. Okay? But stereotyping is when you essentially are generalizing a view toward a person that you have maybe not even met before, right? Um, and this can be related to self-fulfilling prophecy because stereotypes often fuel behaviors. We see that when it comes to just what we're talking about, crime rates. So if there is a perception, stereotype, that certain areas or certain people are more dangerous, and then though that area or those people are treated differently, does that lead then to the statistics? Kind of like the videos that I had you watch. Right? 10 times as many calls on those black vandals than the white vandals. And there were calls for those kids sleeping in the car. Another example of self-fulfilling prophecy. Teachers. What if teachers meet parents and the parents, let's say the parents are doctors. So maybe their perception then is that the child is brilliant, super smart. So then they treat that child differently. They push them harder. And then at the end of the year, the child is brighter because they were treated differently. Okay? There's a couple examples of self-fulfilling prophecy. Recidivism is when someone goes to jail or prison, they're convicted, and they get out and they go back to, they end up committing a crime. That's what we call recidivists. And about 2/3 of our criminals are recidivists. Okay? And some people might look at our spending disparities as perhaps some of the contributing reasons to this. Every state that we had information on, which you can see in that document, shows that we spend more per inmate than per student. And Maryland is about 3 times as much. Okay? And there's a but we know that there is a relationship to the quality of education and then one's chances of entering the criminal justice system. We do see that areas that have low graduation rates, for example, have high incarceration rates. They also tend to be the schools that are funded the lowest. Okay. Move on to social class. So I would say that we live in a society where we often look at social class, not something like a caste system. You're born into a caste and you really can't leave that caste. Social class. So and how we get into these social classes is through what we call a social stratification process. Okay. This is a way of organizing people, often by income or wealth, which is often tied to one's occupation. Right, and that process then leads us to a class structure. What's interesting is if you take the wealthiest 1% of folks in our country and you add up all their wealth, their entire net worth, it's actually worth more than everyone else's combined. Take that in for a second. Okay? There are people who are born billionaires. I think it was something like 25, you have to look on the PowerPoint. 25% of the wealth of the Forbes 400 wealthiest people inherited enough money to be on that list. Okay? The middle class ranges, and you can look at those slides. It ranges the amount of it because lower middle class, really, people just talk about, well, it's the lower middle class is really just before you get to the poverty line, all the way to the upper middle class, which is before you get to the upper class. This is a huge, huge amount of people experiencing life totally differently from the bottom end of the spectrum to the top end of the spectrum. About 75% of the population exists in our middle class. To differentiate absolute and relative deprivation, absolute deprivation has to do with the the basic necessities to live. If you make under $5,000 a year living in the United States, you are probably in absolute deprivation. You probably cannot afford shelter and food. Relative deprivation is relative to cost of living. So you can make let's say $25,000 a year and live in Hagerstown or somewhere like rural Georgia where cost of living is much less. You might be able to survive off $25,000 a year. If you made $25,000 a year and lived in Seattle, San Diego, New York City, you would be relatively deprived. You would be poor relative to the cost of living. Okay? Social mobility refers to moving out of a social class, being able to move. Like in a caste system, you're born into, you don't move. In a class system, there's mobility. Sadly and unfortunately, most people end up in the same, and well, I guess it depends on the one you're born in, but most people end up in the same social class that their parents were in. And let me just give you a real quick example. I would say that I grew up probably lower middle class. My mom was a secretary. Now we call them office associates. And my dad delivered chips. Neither had college education. And but I never struggled. Like I never struggled to have food. I had Christmases and birthdays, and if I needed new shoes, I got new shoes. Uh, we would go on vacation for 3 days a year. We would go to Ocean City, Maryland for a weekend. Usually like a long weekend. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, come back Sunday. Right. So we were definitely not in poverty, but we didn't have, you know, um, you know, we didn't have new cars. We didn't have things that perhaps people who were in middle class or upper class had. My wife grew up probably, I would say, upper middle class. Um, their going out to dinner would have been my wife grew up in Catonsville, would be going down to Little Italy in Baltimore and going to a show, a theater show or something like that, and then going to dinner in Little Italy. Whereas we would often get takeout we had a KFC Taco Bell combination. Um, we often would get stuff from there, right? So where am I now? I have a PhD, college professor. Um, I would say that I would say I'm just right in the middle class. Say I'm not necessarily in the lower middle class, but what's going on? Well, let me tell you. I'm saddled by $100,000 in student loan debt. That is a big difference between my wife and I. My wife had no student loan debt, and she does now. She did for graduate school, but her parents paid for her undergrad. Okay, that my parents could not afford to do that. They were able to give me gas money so that I could drive back and forth to college on the weekends and things like that. They helped me pay for books and things like that. In terms of actual loans, I had to take it all out. And so $100,000 in student loan debts pays back about $400,000 over the course of 30 years. That loan payment is right around $1,000 a month. Okay, that's what happens. That's why people tend to stay in those social classes. Okay, um, social reproduction is just that. It is um, people ending up in the same social class that they were born in, and often it has to do with acquiring cultural capital. One thing that is often um, we often talk about when we talk about cultural capital is education. higher education, right? And so there are many people um, who might be lower income. They might not see success around them of people who have gone to college, because we do know a lot of folks go to college and they have to take developmental or remedial classes. It can be expensive. It can take a long time, and it may be exhausting. And I also realize this is an opportunity cost. You are now paying money to be somewhere when you could be making money. Um, so having a value in education and then being able to afford to do it would be something that you might see based on someone's social class. Not just valuing it, but being able to do it, being able to afford to. Um, that was one of the things. I took out a lot of loans because I also had living expenses that I needed to cover. So, because I didn't have income coming in, right? I did later in graduate school. In fact, that 100,000 is almost all from undergrad. I worked my way through graduate assistantships for pretty much all of my graduate school. So that $100,000 is pretty much just my 4 years of undergrad. The other 7 years of graduate school, pretty much free, paid for through graduate assistantships. All right, let me move on. The digital divide probably, oh my goodness, is so evident right now due to COVID. Digital divide is folks who have access to the internet and a device to get on that internet. And typically, we're not talking about a cell phone, because that's not always the best way to use the internet. It's fine for maybe checking your Facebook account, but probably not the best way to take an exam on D2L. So the digital divide is this gap that exists between those people who have access and those who don't. And so think about COVID. Think about all these students who now went home and had to learn from home. And you might think, well, all the students in in WCPS, they all got iPads. Maybe, but do they have access to the internet? And I know that was a big problem. I know they had talked about like driving this van around and um, having free Wi-Fi. I know that was one of the ideas. All the schools you can drive up but that's different, right? That's way different. Driving up to a school, sitting in their parking lot, and trying to use your iPad versus someone who has a desktop at home or laptop at home, has access to the internet. It's reliable internet, and they're able to kind of do it conveniently at their home. But that's what the digital divide is. Okay. Okay. Let's just talk real quick. This is cumulative, so there are going to be some things from the first exam, but it will primarily be stuff that we didn't cover in the first exam. It's about 50 questions, multiple choice, true, false. I would start with watching this. Obviously, hopefully you've watched this first, but it's okay if you didn't, because you can go through the review PowerPoint's the same thing here. Then I would say things that are unclear, maybe dig into your book, some of the other resources that I have provided for you. And like I said before, I think 4 hours, it's all different. Some people might need an hour, some people might need 10 hours. It's going to be different for everyone. For me, I thought 4 hours was a good amount when I was in college. And I explained to you in the last PowerPoint how I like to do it. I create an outline. From that outline, I kind of start to put things in my own terms, my own words, and then I create index cards. And ultimately, what I'm trying to do is have one or two words associated with one concept. So, like so cultural relativism, Andrew Zimmern would probably be my guy. I would probably know exactly what cultural relativism meant by having Andrew Zimmern be the related concept there. Okay, related person. Okay, good luck.